We're going to take a look here at Soissons. This is a new system, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But this is late World War I, 1918. Obviously, says it right there. After the two German offensives in 18 have kind of petered out, a third one was planned, but then a massive the first French tank offensive began. And in fact, the French were a little upset about Cambrai the year before because they wanted the tanks to be a complete surprise with a huge, on a huge offensive where significant, amounts of tanks would be available. In Cambrai, there weren't enough, and it was still very effective. But anyway, what's my story behind this game? Well, I mean, obviously I love World War I. One of the designers apparently watches my videos and liked them a lot, and he's the one who seems to have made the game. There's a lot of intriguing new stuff in the game, and that seems to be mainly according to the rather extensive designer notes, with two sets of them. One from the original designer who designed it for a class as a more simple SPI style game, and then the other one from the guy who sent me a copy. Who seems to have done a lot of stuff that feels very, very different, and I'm really, really intrigued to see how this is going to play out. It may not. It's a system, I guess, because it says Decisive Victory Volume 1. I'm not sure it's going to apply to very many situations. It may, though, apply very well to that whole sort of, I think it's the 100 Days of Victory or something like that, if I recall correctly. But basically to the period starting here with the Allied attacks, which just kept pounding and forcing the Germans back. And showed their army was ready to collapse. In terms of the association with this, it was a gift from the designer. It wasn't, some kind of review copy or anything like that. In fact, Decision Games doesn't provide review copies. So he sent me one of his copies for it. And an unfortunate thing happened. It's the second time this has happened. I got porch thefted. And I guess because it just never showed up. And, all the delivery information was there and everything. It's also possible it got delivered to the wrong house. That happens occasionally. I know that I get stuff that's not for me. And, usually it's on my street and I can bring it to the person. If it's not, it's more of a pain in the ass. I've had stuff where it's like, well, I don't know how to deal with this. Tried to contact FedEx. Not FedEx, UPS. No, FedEx it was, actually. And they just, they make it this painful thing where you have to, call them and talk to them and everything. And I just wanted to let them know, here's your tracking number, here, it's at my house, pick it up, bring it to the right person. And they didn't. Well, that's the nature. Oh, hi. That's the nature of things in delivery these days. Anyway, let's take a little look at the game. Like I said, World War I. You've got the Allied force, the Entente forces, pushing eastward. And victory conditions are a little weird because it's not necessarily just drive as far as you can. Basically, if you get far enough, it triggers endgame conditions, which might not be for the best. You might want to have a broader foothold before that's triggered. Let's see what we got here. So the map, you have different types of terrain, a nice terrain effects chart to explain them all. a bunch of player aids here. Duplicates of some of them, so combat and bombardment. That's double-sided, so that'll be useful to me. Sequence of play, also double-sided. Combat procedure, and then one to cover the rest of the stuff. So a lot of the rules are going to be covered on here. I have trouble when I'm faced with this many player aid pieces, but you know, as you get used to using them, they're clearly an advantage. And this is something I think Legion does a good job on, is giving you all the player aids and materials that they want. They don't seem to really put a, well, we can't do that. They may be a little different on counter sheets, but I'm not sure. Hold on, I gotta do something about my poor broken chair. Actual combat units themselves, by the way, I have this Gorilla Tape. That's what I'm holding it together with now. I really should glue it first. That was my plan, but this stuff's pretty damn sturdy. It's one of the things that my wife left to me. I guess from one of a couple of different choices she didn't take for a suicide attempt involved that. Maybe she made an attempt, I don't know. Anyhow, with that, obviously she made an attempt. Anyway, onward. The actual units have different values on them. So most of the units are going to be your infantry forces. Now, you have different size units. The Allies are all divisional sized infantry. The Germans have divisions. They also have breakdown unit. Well, they also have regiments, which are on the board to begin with. They have breakdown units for their divisions that turn them into 3 regiments each, which is very useful. And then they have remnants, which are basically, you know, once a regiment is beaten up badly enough, it just turns into something that's, you know, not really an effective combat unit in any sense of the word, but still forces that are present. Units generally don't get destroyed in this game except through failure to retreat. The values on those are going to be a combat value, a dash in the middle that I don't know what. I think it's just for the letter marker. They don't even note it here. And then the combativeness, which is a number of stars. And the more combativeness you have, the better you're going to be at attacking. There's some variance in the strength of the Allied infantry forces. Most of them are 10 strength, but there's some high quality British units. The Americans, wherever they are, are treated the same as the French, and they look exactly the same. Now, the American divisions at this point were about twice the size of a French division, but not only were they relatively fresh, relatively green units, although they proved to be very effective, actually, which you could see in my Rock of the Marne video. Really effective there, because they're still fresh. But also the high command, the French high command, was unwilling to expend them too heavily. There were political reasons behind that. Now, this is kind of interesting. So I don't think I have any game for this late in the war at an operational level, which is something I probably should have said earlier. I had intended to. You have little tank guys over here. which are going to provide a die roll modifier, and they have limitations to how they can be used. The setup is not free, but it's player choices involved in it. Basically, the Germans set up along the front line, which is this border here, and then the Entente is allowed to set up anywhere on their side of stuff, but they want to get the attack rolling, and they get certain advantages for setting up next to the enemy. They get these free prepare markers, and you really want to start driving the Germans right away. So this is my assumption of what I want to do for setup. I'm fairly comfortable with most of the German pieces. The only things I'm maybe iffy about is those 2 artillery pieces, and those might shift around. These units are reforming. Well, no, they're actually not. They're damaged units. They have hits against them. There's a reforming unit back here. You also have divisional artillery pieces, which are going to be, that's where the headquarters is, and that's going to determine the range for the artillery. And that's one of the reasons I'm not sure I want to be that far back or maybe that close. I may need to reposition those a little bit, but that shouldn't make much difference. I'll try to keep the same concept in mind, so that the Allies wouldn't reposition their forces afterwards. Okay, counters. These are strength point loss counters, look pretty normal. These are remnant units, which have 2 sides on them to indicate whether they're disorganized or shaken. Shaken is worse than disorganized. Regular units on the back side have a disorganized status to them. It's kind of the reverse on these, but yeah. That keeps you from having to have as many shaken markers on the board. Shaken markers, this is a result when the organization starts failing worse and worse. You've got prepare markers. These indicate that you've got, well, they could indicate 2 things. They could indicate that you're set up with defensive artillery in place and whatnot, and that can give you an advantage, slight advantage. But they can also indicate that you're ready for an attack and you're going to make an assault. A prepared attack with bonuses for artillery support, etc. And then on the other side of this is the improvised attacks and light attacks, more mobile situations where you're not taking all that time to prepare. You may actually just be probing, and they're less expensive to conduct. You're going to be spending movement points to prepare or engage in combat. A lighter variant. Retreat markers, when units retreat, they get one of these. That limits their capabilities. And these are, I believe, bombardment markers. These are the breakdowns for the divisions. Air support, which is going to work very much like artillery. It's just got freer range. Some of the German divisions come in on the board later. The ones that are on the board to begin with are assigned to a specific corps. The ones that come in later are able to be flipped to one side or the other to indicate which corps you're going to assign them to for the rest of the game. This game worries heavily about command and control. If you remember the 1914 games that I played, the 2 that I have, there are basically boundaries between the different armies, and you can't cross them. You had to keep your forces in a certain kind of... each command had its own boundaries. Well, this takes that concept down to the corps level. And yeah. And... it's gonna be even more complicated and painful if you get your stuff outside of its regular command function. You'll see how that is. Basically, the answer there is don't do this. You know, the bad effects of it are basically you could have 2 units from different corps, if they get reversed, cut each other's supply off so that neither one is in supply. So that's kind of annoying. Spent no withdrawal markers. When an Allied division, an Entente division, ends up below half strength, it is spent. And the Entente should withdraw those units. If they choose not to, they're not going to be effective on attack, but they might be useful still to have on the board. There's a victory point penalty that's accumulated for them. You have these shaken and reform counters here. Talked about the prepares, the retreats, the booms. That's about it there. Okay. Whew. All right. Let's take a look at the rules. They're different. They seem to be pretty well written. It's been a while since I read them. I read them about a week ago. Thought I was going to get to this. Well, I planned on getting to this after Austerlitz. The heat wave has caused me to do things down here instead. So Austerlitz is on hold. But unfortunately, instead of jumping right to this, I played a couple of economic games. The first one was just kind of like, I don't really feel like starting the war game. It'll be more complicated and everything. And then that game got me really excited about trying another one. I wasn't even planning on bidding it, but I sort of kind of did. All right. Let's take a look at how the rules cover things. Okay. The game ends. Good place to start. It started with setup, which I've already conducted. When an Entente non-spent division exits the map off the eastern side, or occupies a Soissons perimeter hex, which are those red stars. The Ain River back there is completely impassable. So that's just extra stuff that you're not allowed to operate on. Although there's a bridge over it. Maybe you can move over there. I don't know. So then the game will end following the Entente end of operations segment on that turn. If that doesn't happen, the game continues on until turn 23. Now, I need to swap batteries. Once you count victory points, you get them for control of specific victory point hexes or being close to them. Each town hex that doesn't have a victory point value, so this one has a victory point value on it, and that's how much it's worth. Each town hex that doesn't have one, that's still German controlled at the end of the game, the Entente takes -2 points for. Towns inside Soissons perimeter and north of the Ain are ignored for this. You're not expected to reach those. For each victory point location on the map, the Entente gets a number of victory points equal to the value of the town if the Entente controls it. If it's not, they get a number of victory points equal to the victory point value minus the distance from that town to the closest Entente unit. Multi-hex town, there's at least one of them, counts as 2 separate victory point locations. Okay, it doesn't appear that there's any penalty for victory point towns, if the Germans hold those. So the idea there is, these are further east. These are the goals. But if the Germans are still holding stuff up here, here's the 2 hex town. If the Germans are still holding stuff on the other side of the map, you're going to get penalized for that. And those are the ones without victory points. So that all makes sense. Victory points are scored only once per location. The same Entente unit can be used to score victory points for multiple locations. Alright. The Entente also gets points. Oh, here we go. There's more. Okay. Each unwithdrawn spent Entente division costs a victory point. The Entente gets 1 victory point if they have at least 12 non-spent divisions on the map at the end of the game. If the game ends early, either by going off the map or occupying Soissons perimeter, the Entente gains additional victory points equal to the number of remaining turns on the turn track plus 1, regardless of how many units exited the map. So you only need to remove 1. Soissons perimeter victory points and map exit victory points may be accumulated, but the Entente can only gain early end of game victory points once for exiting the map, regardless of how many units did so, and once for reaching the Soissons perimeter, regardless of how many reached the perimeter. So let's look at this again. The Entente player gains equal to the number of remaining turns, regardless of how many Soissons perimeter VPs. I don't see any. This is going to answer my question. I'm just curious whether I see what I expect there. 1 Entente unit reaches Soissons perimeter hex and 1 exits the map on July 23rd. Game ends and the Entente gets 1 for reaching a Soissons perimeter hex. No turns left plus 1. And 1 victory point for exiting the map. The same thing. So basically, it looks to me like you're going to get... oh, here it is. If the game ends due to either of these conditions, you get the number of victory points. But if you manage to do both of them, you get twice as many victory points. Okay. And the break-even point is between 9 and 11. Historical was within the break-even. So you're fighting against history as opposed to, you know, hey, how did you do well according to the high command? Now, the high command, I think it was... oh, geez, I can't remember. I think it was Patan. But, yeah, I think it was Patan who came by after the first day of the battle and said, yep, you're done. You did good. And the commander on the field basically argued that and didn't get an answer. So he said, well, better to ask forgiveness than actually get permission, or easier. Okay. You control a town if it's occupied by the Entente, or if a contiguous path free of Entente zones of control, or this is called threat zone, it's a new acronym, cannot be traced from the town to the German eastern map edge. The town location itself is not included in the path. It can be of any length, but it can never move closer to the Entente map edge. Otherwise, it's considered German controlled. For each hex of a 2-hex town, it's considered separate towns. They have their own victory points on them. Town control affects the movement points required to enter the town hex. Yeah, once you take control of a town, it becomes easier to move into. That makes sense. Oh, boy. I am getting to the end of my day here. It's probably around noon, and I'm really fatigued. So I'm going to break right now. If I still can't sleep, maybe I'll come back and continue on. But I don't want to dig into the rules too much. Do I want to look at the sequence of play? See, the sequence of play is quite detailed, and it requires... there's a lot of weird stuff going on in this game, and it links together, but we're going to have to see how it plays together, because it's just a very different system. So the time scale of the game, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, is we have an AM, PM, and night turn, with the night turn twice as long. Does that really make sense in July? Not really, but so the timing's a little different. In general, although night fighting was possible in the period, it didn't happen very much. And in this particular circumstance, it was mainly used for reorganization and whatnot. On my personal side of things, I've swapped completely to becoming a creature of the night, essentially. Yeah, I stayed up until noon, but, I'm functional now. It's midnight, past midnight, actually, but because when I wake up, there are things that I have to catch up with on my online games and stuff like that. None of which are all that interesting. So, in the sequence of play, so the first thing that happens is, let's see, you check, okay. The first thing that happens in the game is the first surprise turn, which is the turn in which the Entente is launching their attack. And these phases are going to align with phases that'll be explained very shortly. But I think it's kind of nice to start with the first turn surprise. I don't know if the sequence of play here, no. It doesn't call out the surprise turn special cases, which I think is for the best. You want to keep the player aid to be generally useful, not just useful on one turn, or not use up a lot of the space for one turn's usage, unless it's just modifiers or whatnot, which may be in there. So the first thing is there's going to be an artillery availability phase. Normally, both sides determine how much artillery they have, which is marked on here. Medium artillery, heavy artillery. And that'll be divided into day points. I don't know why the night is 1/1, 2/1. Because I thought the slash is, we'll see. We'll see what that means. But for the AM artillery, generally you have to roll dice to see if it's available. And that which isn't available will be available in the PM points. And that'll just be recorded on here. Both sides have their own tracks for what that's worth. But on this first surprise turn, the Entente's going to get all of it. Then we jump to an assault segment. Now, normally, what you're going to have is some other steps in the way here. But in the assault segment on the first turn surprise, the Entente is already in set and prepared. All their units, though, must conduct an assault that are adjacent to the enemy. That will not always be the case. The Germans aren't going to be able to use any defensive artillery on barrage. I don't know that they have any points at this point. Terrain DRMs are ignored when resolving the assaults. However, tanks will suffer an unfavorable DRM when coming out of the woods. That may change things, because I set up my Entente units to get good odds on bad terrain to make up for the DRMs there. So let me consider whether I want to change that over the course of these rules and whatnot, because I may want to launch attacks in more places to get a broader attack. I was looking at it and saying, I don't know about that. I had better try to compensate for some of this stuff. So there are a couple places tanks can't be used. There's one place they can't be used, which is in these ravines. But they're also less effective against woods hexes, which makes sense, but they're fully effective against towns as far as I can tell. And I think that's the only terrain of any importance. Okay. Could look on here and see. Yeah. There's streams as well, which if you're attacking across a stream, you get a penalty. Well, what does it mean to be attacking across a stream? Because here it's in the middle of the road. Yeah, it's not clear what across is. So we're going to have to see how that's expressed. So when I read the rules the first time, it's just me sitting and reading through them. And they made sense there, but now looking at the map, I'm getting myself some questions because the streams appear to run down the hex line, or through the middle of a hex. So across becomes kind of a weird situation. Maybe we'll see that in the combat section. I'm not sure. Okay. Terrain DRMs, though, do affect the bombardment. So bombardment, there's some penalties for the cover that the hex provides from artillery. Okay. Combat-inflicted disruption results against Entente attackers are ignored, including aggravated disruption, but losses will be applied normally. German units, and none of this really makes sense, but it's good to have it here. You read through it, you see what these are, and then when we go back to do the first turn, or to prepare for it as I will, I'll probably look at it again and try to figure out if things are right. German units that were assaulted gain a disruption level at the end of combat, in addition to anything else they get in the CRT. And if there's a mandatory retreat result on the CRT, which is these superscripts, they are in effect only during this special assault segment. It's part of the effects of the surprise. Okay. And we're going to look here. We see the bombardment declarations. That actually, these are special rules that apply into here. So these are still going to happen. This is just giving insight into special cases in that first turn, and we'll see it. Movement allowances for all good order Entente units that conducted an assault is going to be 8 movement points. Now they say instead of the normal 4, I thought it was 6, but we'll see. On top, again, it's been too long since I read through it. Usually I do the read through, the initial read through, and then come back for this more detailed look, which is a helpful combination to me. The way I played before I did videos was I would just do that read through and then I'd skim and look things up as I needed. This gives an extra level. I still make mistakes all over the place because these games are complicated. Entente low intensity improved attack segment step. Okay, in this particular case, during this section, they're going to be immune to aggravated disruption for it. Okay. Let's go to the standard sequence of play that's going to affect everything else. The sequence of play is not really bypassed by this. What it is these are modifiers into it that take effect during those special stages, and they're just being called out. And it's a useful place to have them, I guess. Okay. So, on each turn, the first thing is a mutual artillery availability. Each player looks at the AP allotments for the day, and for each one, they roll a die. So we would look here. We got day 3/1 for medium artillery. Oh, I got it. Entente Germany. That's why. Okay, so yeah, it's clear when you look. So yeah, there's going to be these points available for the day, but you have to get a 1 through 4 to have the artillery points available during the AM turn. And if you don't, they get marked down on the PM turn marker, which there may not be enough markers to handle both. That's going to be kind of troubling, isn't it? Players place the markers on their AM or PM side of the Army Artillery missions track to keep track of how many are available each. So this will say AM, and PM or night on it. But at this particular time, I need both of those, don't I? You know, like, well, maybe not, because there aren't a lot of points available. But here the Germans have 2 medium artillery in the AM turn, where they might have 1 of each. And then it starts going up. Yeah, I think we're going to have some issues where I may have to put an extra marker on the board that's not provided by in the counter mix. I thought the 1-1s would cancel that out, and the fact that here all the points are available in the AM turn. It's not that big a deal, but okay. And then at the points that are available at night are just available at night. In fact, there's no carryover between PM and night. The day points are AM, PM. The night points are all you have for night, and there's no carryover between night and AM. Basically, some shelling is going to happen at night, and it kind of doesn't matter when it happens during the night. Okay. And because there are no assaults and whatnot, it means it happens at one point at night for everybody. All right. The next thing that happens is that the core artillery, which are these markers here, on the backside they have no artillery on them. These all get recharged in the AM turn. And then you'll be able to use them once during the course of the day. And once more at night, I think. The phasing player, okay, reinforcements. The phasing player places units scheduled as reinforcements for the current turn. Stacked on the reinforcement schedule on the map on any hex adjacent to his friendly map edge. However, you'll want to keep them in the core assignment they're going to be in. Now, the phasing player is Entente in this case. When we get to the Germans, who are going to have a, hey, they do the same thing as the Entente does type of explanation on their sequence of play, we have to worry a little bit more because German reinforcements have to be assigned to a corps at this point. The corps that you wish to move them up towards. On tank group assignments and reassignment, you can reposition your tank groups that are attached to infantry divisions into an in-command adjacent Entente infantry division of the same corps, unless there's a ravine that blocks it. The Entente then attaches any of the tank groups that they have available over here to any division that's on map in command and not in a ravine, not blocked by ravines. It's possible to go into a ravine. The road here allows you to get into that ravine, which might make sense if you have a division here and you want to attack out of the ravine. Oh boy, I gotta do something about my nose. I'm getting more lingering colds again. I became immune to them when I moved from Phoenix to here, but now they're coming back. They've been a thing throughout my life, but I don't know what they are and what causes them. Maybe the amount of dust that I gather in my house. It's quite possible. I sleep in a room with years of dust accumulated in it. All right. First bombardment declaration. The phasing player declares bombardments. They place these bombardment markers to indicate how many points of bombardment in any hexes adjacent to a friendly prepare marker, i.e. that they're prepared to attack them, following certain range and command restrictions. And if you're using army artillery points, you mark them down on that. These will be resolved very shortly. All right, we hit the assault phase. The non-phasing player can declare defensive artillery barrages. Place a non-phasing player's bombardment marker onto hexes that are adjacent to a non-phasing unit and containing a phasing unit with a prepare marker, i.e. you can see that the phasing player is preparing an assault. They're going through all the efforts for that. It's obvious to you, and you're able to bombard it before any of the attacking happens. And again, you spend off any attack markers, you flip these guys as needed, whatever. Okay. All bombardments, including defensive artillery barrages, conducted against a hex adjacent to a friendly prepare marker during the assault segment are resolved with a +1 DRM on the bombardment table. Phasing bombardments will automatically get this in this phase because the only bombardments that were allowed to be placed were those with the prepare markers. There are other times when you'll be able to bombard where you won't get this. Now, this is important because the Germans have prepare markers, but they're very unlikely to launch counterattacks in this whole game, from what I can tell. From what the play guides explain. And there's extensive notes on how to play as well, which, again, I find this very, very, like designer's notes, I find those kind of things very helpful towards guiding, learning the game. You know, they may not be the eventual strategy that I would use, but they give me a clue to start, you know, trying to figure the game out. And I like that. Some people are like, oh, you should be able to figure the whole game out on your own. You know, in a way, but bare rules don't always express the intent. So a combination of both designer's notes and some hints towards play, sometimes the things may seem obvious, sometimes not. Sometimes they may just be wrong, like in Freedom in the Galaxy. Okay. And yeah, I'm taking my time on this one. I don't know why, in terms of lots of babble in the instructions, whatnot. But where was I? Yeah, so the German ones give them the capability to say, you know what, we've set up our defensive fire zones and all that, and we know that the enemy is preparing an attack here, or we're prepared for the enemy to prepare an attack here, and we've bonused our own units. Now, there are reasons why the prepare markers don't work terribly well against non-prepared assaults. They can still help, but you have less note. But at the beginning of the game, the Germans are surprised. They're not expecting an assault, so they don't have any prepare markers. They don't have any artillery available. Well, they don't have any artillery they can fire on defensive assaults. Okay. Now, after that, you're going to resolve all assaults one at a time in the order the phasing player sees fit, with all the effects taking place after the assault, which gives some opportunity for degrading an enemy's position with prior attacks, which might actually cause them to fall back before you attack. A phasing unit with a prepare marker may declare an assault against adjacent enemy-occupied hacks. Remember, on the first turn, you got to make attacks everywhere. However, if you do make an assault, and we'll get this somewhere in here, if you do make an assault on an enemy unit, all the enemy units adjacent, or if you do make an assault from a friendly hex, all the enemy units adjacent to that hex must be assaulted during that particular attack phase. So you have to be prepared to make soak-off attacks and stuff like that as needed. Then you resolve the assault, including a preliminary resolution of the bombardments against the assaulted hex or any other hexes that are being attacked. The target units that become shocked, spent, or are reduced to remnants immediately lose their prepare marker, for whatever that matters. It's just it's just a means of knocking that off them if you take casualties. They've already gotten the chance to bombard based on it, though. Each assault declaration, bombardment, combat resolution must be completed before the next one. Once the phasing bombardment is resolved, the attack... Okay, so if you do a bombardment as part of an assault, you must complete the assault. You've already committed to it at that point. You could wait and do it later after you made or didn't make the assault, if you wish, if you didn't program it in already. All enemy units in the attacking unit's zone of control must be attacked during the attack segment. Yeah. And that puts a little bit of a burden in terms of the jumping all over the map type of stuff you want to do by regions, but we do that naturally, I think. The defender can convert one loss result into a one hex retreat in addition to whatever results they have. So if they take an actual loss, they can switch that to giving up some terrain. Now, the game's all about terrain, so, you know, it becomes that, do I keep victory or do I preserve force? Defending units that retreat and do not already have a retreat marker get one. This includes headquarters, which will lose their artillery if they had it available, if they're forced to retreat. Defending combat units that retreat and already have a retreat marker get an additional level of disruption. German retreating divisions are allowed to break down during that in order to cover more ground as they fall back. Victorious assaulting units do not get an advance at this point. They're going to have to spend movement points. Remember, we haven't moved yet, right? So these prepared assaults, now I'm going to get to plug forward after I make those assaults. It's a good sequence for this kind of attack, that you set up the assault entirely, then you get the advance afterwards, instead of move up and attack that's so common and was probably present in the original version of the game from what the designer's notes looked like. After all assaults have been completed, remove prepare markers on any units that did not assault. I'm not going to be able to give a good answer as to why that's the case, why you wouldn't still be set up to make an assault. But you can make up for that by expending movement points to put the prepare marker back during your movement turn, so don't worry too much about it. First non-phasing player voluntary fallback. The non-phasing units, including units that have a retreat marker, shocked units, spent units, and remnants, are allowed to fall back. And there are very specific rules to handle this to preserve, well, the retreat rules on the Germans are extremely strict, as are their supply rules. This is some of the stuff that leads me to wonder how much this system would work if you plugged it into other periods of the war at all, you know, including like the German advances in immediately preceding this. You would reverse it, obviously. The Allies would have the more restrictive results. I don't think it would work as well, but we'll see. This is called Decisive Victory 1918. I believe it's intended to be a system just for that period where the Entente is attacking the Germans. It may only actually work on this particular battlefield and a couple others, because it is it has very specific applications to it. That's kind of the wrong word, but okay. Units that can fall back an unlimited number of hexes as long as they follow their fallback restrictions. Headquarters not stacked with a friendly combat unit that choose to fall back have to fall back at least 3 hexes, though. Units that fall back and did not already have a retreat marker get one, and headquarters lose their artillery if they had it available. Combat units that fall back and already have a retreat marker get an extra point of disruption. Now, what is disruption? Well, disruption is flipping over, but I believe the next step of it is shock markers after you get that. Okay, then we hit the maneuver phase. Again, for the phasing player, in this case, it would be the Entente on the first turn. The phasing units with a retreat marker, shocked units, spent units, and remnants will not be allowed to activate during the maneuver segment. Phasing units spend their movement point allowance moving and or acquiring prepare, or the other side of those markers, the quicker combat option, the unprepared combat. Improvised attack, low intensity, up to the limit of the countermix. So the Entente has a huge number of these prepare markers. You can see I've got a lot on the board and I've got a bunch more. They're probably not too limited. The Germans have a very, very limited set of these markers. And remember, they're useful as a defensive artillery setup, but if you want to do any kind of counterattack, you're going to need these markers, and you're only allowed to make a very limited number. You probably don't need more, except for defensive artillery fire, where you can put them all over the damn place. Okay. Normally, units that are not in an enemy zone of control are allowed to move. If they didn't conduct an assault, they can use 6 movement points if they're in good order, 3 if they're reforming or disorganized. Now, remember, we have a special case here. Movement allowance of all good order Entente units that conduct an assault get 8. Now, they say instead of 4, that comes down here. Yeah, that's right. Combat units that have conducted an assault and are marked with a prepare marker will normally only get 4 movement points in good order, or 2 if they're reforming or disorganized. As soon as the unit's activated, it loses its prepared marker, and if you don't activate a unit during this maneuver phase, it loses its prepare marker. Headquarters are allowed to move a maximum of 1 hex regardless of any terrain. Combat units have to pay a movement point cost to get prepare markers, which cost 4 movement points during the day, or a low improvised attack, which will cost them 1 or 2 movement points depending on terrain. And that is not specified on here, unfortunately. Up to the limit of the countermix. I know that it costs more. No, I don't. I don't want to say that. When you put an improvised attack in place, it's got a little arrow in it. That has to point to the hex you're intending to attack. This is okay because you kind of know everything you're going to do when you place these, right? Those aren't going to last very long. They happen after the movement phase. So you have combat, movement, combat, basically. Now, remember, if you conducted an assault and you're still in good order, you could drop another prepare marker and be set up for another assault the next turn, but then you wouldn't move. Other units that didn't conduct an assault will be able to move a couple of hexes maybe and drop a prepare marker. But the first turn, because of the huge movement point allowance that the assaulting Entente units get, they get to get a fairly significant, I guess, breakthrough, essentially, and further movement off of it. I know this seems kind of complex, but it really does look like it's going to hang together well. Units with a prepare marker can discard it once activated. Well, they must discard it, but then they can immediately reacquire. No combat of any kind at night, so there's no point to picking up a prepare marker during the PM turn, because you will not be able to use it. Units in an enemy zone of control may not move, but they can use their movement points to acquire prepare or low-end improvised attack markers. This is important. Adjacent to the enemy, most enemy units will have a zone of control. You're not allowed to move. There's also an idea of this threat zone, or some people, similar to what some earlier games called zone of influence, I guess, that stretches out beyond the zone of control. Non-phasing emergency fallback. Non-phasing units, including units that have a retreat marker, shocked units, spent units, and remnants that become isolated at any point during the current maneuver segment due to movement of the phasing unit, interrupt that movement at that moment and conduct an emergency fallback where they're forced to give more ground up. And this doesn't cost them any movement points or anything, so you could have situations where units are retreating quite a bit. This makes sense because movement allowances for the units are probably way under what they could actually move. Okay, I gotta swap batteries. Units that are stacked with a friendly unit and are contacted by an enemy unit that moves adjacent to them must do an emergency fallback of at least 3 hexes at this point. Once emergency fallback is executed, the interrupted phasing unit resumes its maneuver movement with any remaining movement points. Units can fall back as many times as they want. There's no limit to how far they can fall back. Units that fall back and did not already have a retreat marker get one. Headquarters are flipped to artillery of unavailable. If they already had a retreat marker, they get a disruption level. And then there's a voluntary fallback again, just like the last one, where you can say, hey, it's looking like I need to cover this gap better, and let's shrink my line a little bit. Before I go on, I wanted to talk a little bit about something kind of outside the game, but that influences hey, what's going on in terms of the Austerlitz game that I've got going on. So that particular, the heat is so high today, well, this week, that I've been taking off from that, fine. But I have this other camera that I could conceivably use, but the quality of that camera is so poor. First of all, it makes everything kind of yellow. And secondly, I looked at some of the shots of it, and everything looks fuzzy. It's supposedly, high definition or something. Maybe I've got the settings wrong on it. But my thought had been, well, I could slip in a turn of Austerlitz to break things up, once a day or something like that. But because I do have that extra camera that I could use. But I'm just not sure unless I can get better visual off of it. I do have a means of compiling videos from it, which was my main initial worry, but I didn't realize how shitty the video appeared. Okay, back to the sequence of play. Yeah, we always have these kind of crappy interjections in there. Second bombardment declaration. The phasing player can drop more bombardment markers for the points that they want to put in. Expending the points for it. Abiding to range and command restrictions. The targeted hex doesn't have to be adjacent to any kind of attack marker. The phasing player bombardments are resolved during the following, immediately following segments, which is the low intensity and improvised attack. Okay. Then the non-phasing player can declare defensive artillery barrages, place their bombardment markers on hexes adjacent to a non-phasing unit and containing at least one phasing unit with an attack marker. You adjust the artillery missions track accordingly. Resolve all the non-phasing players' defensive artillery barrages. Unless shocked, spent, or reduced to remnants, the targeted units that become disrupted retain their markers on them. Okay. But remember, a second level of disruption, I think, brings you to shocked. Then you resolve all the low-intensity improvised attacks, starting with a phasing player with a low-intensity improvised marker may declare an attack against an adjacent enemy-occupied hex its marker is pointing to, and it may attack other hexes as well, and it may be forced to, as long as it attacks the hex the marker is pointing at. Resolve the low-intensity improvised attacks, including any preliminary bombardments that you have there. Each attack declaration, bombardment, combat resolution must be completed before the next one. Once the phasing bombardment is resolved, the attacker must carry through with an attack with all designated attacking units, if still eligible, against all designated defender hexes, regardless of the outcome of the bombardment. So if you're launching a bombardment against a hex you point to, you have to make that attack. All enemy units in the attacking unit zone of control must be attacked during the attack segment. Again, you can't direct at one thing. It's kind of funny. The game kind of says, well, that's unlike most war games. I don't know if I feel that way. Maybe it's becoming less common, but the idea that you have to attack everything adjacent to you, that was kind of up until the late 70s. That was almost every game, and then it has continued to be a fairly common usage, so I don't know. Okay. Defender can still convert losses into retreats. Defending units that retreat get their retreat markers, etc. It goes into all the detail. There's a lot of repetition in this rule book. Now, some people, there are a couple of reasons not to like that. Some people don't like reading the same thing again and again. It makes it harder to maintain the rule book, so errors can creep in, where like that repetitive sequence is correctly done is corrected somewhere, and then you have to find everywhere else where that is repeated. So it becomes kind of a maintenance nightmare. However, and the way around that is often to put really good reference numberings. I haven't noticed anywhere where, at least yet, where this is like had a maintenance issue. It appears that there's been really good editing, and the development side of this has so far at least looks pretty good in terms of making sure everything stayed coherent. Maybe they have software to help with that now. The other thing, I could easily see that because you could capture those things externally and insert and have auto insertions and such on. The other thing is the reference numbers are really good throughout it, and honestly, if you've got the paper, if you're willing to put the page, the extra text in, I find it really helpful. When I go to a section, I get almost all of what I get everything I need in that section. I don't have to go following the reference numbers, etc. So it's kind of a best of both worlds in terms of the way the rule book is laid out. The only thing that it does, some people do have problems with reading the same thing again and again on their first read through. Personally, I find it kind of helpful. I can skim over it if I'm like, I just saw that. But I could on the other hand, it's this reinforcement. Reading the same thing again is helpful. Anyway, that's just that. Victorious units keep their marker. They'll be given an opportunity to advance during the advanced segment based on that. After all attacks have been completed, so yeah, we won't worry about that. After all attacks have been completed, remove the low improvised attack markers on units that did not attack or whose targeted hex was not vacated. Resolve the phasing player's remaining bombardments, any that aren't involved in attacks. Any that they did here before that, they have to attack the hex, but then you're allowed to do some further softening up. You probably don't want to. You probably want it to get it all assigned to your attacks, but, well, we'll see. Okay, the advanced step. Units that have still a low-end improvised attack marker that's pointing to a unit, or that's pointing to a now empty hex, basically, because otherwise it got removed, and are not in an enemy zone of control, can perform a 1 hex advance into that hex, or a hex adjacent to that hex. Units that have a prepare marker that are not in an enemy zone of control can do a 1 hex advance in any direction, and they retain their prepare marker. A unit can't advance if by doing so it causes a friendly unit to become isolated. The non-phasing player has to do an emergency fallback again. Here that they actually do reference you back to it because it's exactly the same text. At the end of operations, all phasing retreat markers are removed. Phasing. If it takes you a player turn to recover from a retreat. If the German operations phase has been completed, the turn markers move to the next phase on the turn marker. Okay, the Germans do exactly the same as the Entente did. Now, the PM turn is slightly different. Here are the differences, but for the most part it's the same. Unused Entente and German artillery and air support APs left over in the AM turn are added to the APs available during the PM turn. And then you do the PM operations, which are exactly the same as these, except you have the night turn coming up. All right, let's talk about the night turn, but I think I need a little teeny bit of a break first. All right. The night turn is very different. First thing is, the Entente can withdraw their divisions that are currently spent. Now, spent is, I think, half strength or less than half strength. These divisions are removed from the map. If they choose to keep their spent divisions on the map, they get these spent no withdrawals, and they have a very limited number of them. They're going to cost them, they have 3. They're going to cost them victory points if they do it. I assume there's a counter mix limit on it. It doesn't spell that out here. Tank groups attached to removed or spent divisions can either be repositioned to an adjacent division if that division's in command, not in a ravine, blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, it's removed from play. So you can't throw it back into your full reserve. If the removal of a spent division causes a friendly unit to become isolated, that unit has to do a emergency fallback. Then all on-map tank groups already on the reduced side are removed from play. All on-map full-strength tank groups are flipped to their reduced side because one of the major impacts, one of the major things that was destroying tanks was just breakdowns. These things were relatively fragile compared to armor that you're used to in World War II. I love this thing. This was one of the worst tanks made in any quantity. And it basically couldn't cross the wider trenches that were created after Cambrai, and just really caused itself issues. Okay. German Remnant Incorporation, starting on July 19th's night turn, which is the second day of the battle, and every subsequent night turn, the German player chooses 2 remnant units and removes them from play. I assume if they don't have any remnants left, it doesn't hurt them. But this is just, let's incorporate some of the lost units, but you get nothing for it. Then, later you're going to get to use them to bolster units as well. Players check the turn track to see how many artillery points they have. These are automatically going to be available, and they're all you get. Then you get Night Mutual Bombardment. The Entente player throws bombardment markers on any enemy unit on the map, abiding to rage and command. The German player does the same. You resolve the bombardments. Night bombardments will have an automatic -1 DRM to them. You're also not going to be allowed to use air power at night. Then we go to operations. First, non-phasing voluntary fallback. The non-phasing player is able to do a regular voluntary fallback. Phasing units with a retreat marker, shocked units, spent units, and remnants do not activate during the night maneuver. Combat units can spend their movement point allowance to acquire a prepare marker. It's 5 movement points during the night, up to the limit. You're not allowed to create an improvised attack because that would have to be resolved at night. Phasing units that are not in an enemy zone of control may move. Now, that may move is important. You're allowed to spend movement points as long as you don't move. Combat units get 8 movement points if in good order for forming or disorganized. Headquarters can move 1 hex regardless of terrain. Phasing units in an enemy zone of control may not move, but they can use movement points to get a prepare markers. Yeah, I said that. Interdiction to movement into an isolated position or cause isolation of a friendly unit. You can't move into an isolated position if you move into a position that isolates another unit. That unit has to fall back. Then we go to the second non-phasing voluntary fallback. They get to do it again after the advances to say, yeah, this situation's become degraded. And that's going to, again, cause retreat markers, which could cause you issues in the next turn. Advance. Units with a prepare marker that are not in an enemy zone of control can perform a 1 hex advance in any direction. They keep their prepare marker. So this gives them an extra an extra space of movement, which they'd get during the daytime as well. But a unit cannot advance if by doing so it causes a friendly unit to become isolated. Non-phasing emergency fallback. The non-phasing player has to retreat. Oh, this is an emergency here. So yeah, and then end of operations. All phasing retreat markers are removed. If this is the German operations phase, you go to the next day, first AM turn. And the German turn is exactly the same. Then we hit reorganization. All disrupted German and Entente units that are in an enemy zone of control lose 1 point of disruption. If you're not in an enemy zone of control, Entente units And out-of-command German units reduce disruption by 2 levels. In-command German units get a die roll chance, 50-50, of reducing by 3 levels instead. And then the German player can reconstitute any number of German regiments by combining 2 disorganized remnants. Disorganized is the best remnants you have. They're either disorganized or shocked. You can't do shocked ones. Stacked together and within command range of a headquarters if the formed regiment complies with all conditions. Okay. Now it's time for a real break. My throat's starting to go. Yeah. It's so easy to get distracted. I mean, I've wandered away for a couple of hours when I didn't really intend to, and just found things to, when really time is probably still as big a deal as it ever was. Combativeness rating, that's the number of stars on here. That's going to provide a DRM in combat. Strength point loss markers, I've already talked about there. Spent divisions, okay, here it's defined. When you lose half or less of your initial, or when you're reduced to half or less initial strength, you're spent. And they give the specific amounts of hits that you have to take. Spent Entente divisions will be removed from play unless you're willing to take a victory point penalty. But they're not going to be able to attack anymore. I alluded to that. German divisions that are spent remain in play. German regiments don't become spent, but they can end up as remnants. Trying to see where the statement is. Spent divisions cannot attack. Okay. Because I see this as a note for it, but I'm trying to move quickly. Tank groups. Tank groups have no strength points, no combativeness rating. What they're going to do is give you a +2 DRM on attacks, unless they're into the woods, in which case they're +1. The reduced strength will always give +1 strength DRM. Even into woods, it's not reduced. Any unit involved in the attack doesn't have to be the lead attacker, a concept we haven't hit yet. There's a lead attacker, lead defender. Other games have this kind of thing where the morale is determined by that and first loss. Tanks that are attached to out-of-command units still work normally, but tanks attached to units that cannot attack can't give a bonus, which makes sense. A tank group has to be stacked with a division at all times. No more than 1 tank group can be stacked with a single division. If they maneuver advanced along with the division they're stacked with, if the division retreats or falls back a hex, the tank group will be reduced. So remember, they take a reduction at the end of each day, but they also take it from any kind of retreat or fallback. Anything that gives you a retreat marker. If the division retreats or falls back more than 1 hex, it'll be eliminated. The tank groups coming as reinforcements show up here where they can be deployed. And you could actually hold off on doing so if you're not planning on attacking much. Tank groups cannot enter ravines except along roads, and they can only exit them along a road, which is okay because the only place where ravines have a road, it goes through them. There's no dead ends. But it limits your capability. Tank groups can't attack into ravines, regardless of the road. There doesn't appear to be any kind of rule against attacking out of a ravine. This bugs the shit out of me because I think there are conditions like here where you could attack up here and get the tank bonus. I'm not thrilled about that, but I guess they're rolling around. I don't know. If a unit with an attached tank attacks into multiple hexes, some of them ravine, the tank DRM is only applied if the lead defender is not in the ravine. Again, that's where the focus of the attack is, so everything works there. Multiple tank groups attacking into a single hex accumulate their DRMs. Let me make sure that is positive. Yeah. It could have been stated, what I'm saying is it could have been meaning the exact opposite of what I made it sound like. If it was written differently. During the Entente tank group assignment and reassignment, you're able to attach tanks from the asset box to an in-command unit. Otherwise, it's in-command adjacent Entente infantry of the same corps. You're able to move at one space. We've got the attrition already. We discussed during the sequence of play. Voluntary removal, you can remove them at any time. This doesn't really do anything for you except if you want infantry to move into a ravine or maybe attack into a ravine or something. Well, it can attack, it just doesn't provide the bonus. Remnants. Okay, German remnants are units that are reduced to 1 strength point. Shocked units are replaced by a shocked remnant with the same number of shock levels. Other units will automatically be disorganized, which might increase their disorganization by 1. Remnants have zone of control and threat zones, just like anything else. Not that we've discussed those yet. This is a little weird. So, like, some games will have, like, a concepts section. I don't know how helpful, which discusses a bunch of stuff before you ever run into it. I'm always a little iffy on that. So, in some cases with this, I feel like, oh, geez, these rules have been talking about things and I don't know what the hell they're talking about. It's always difficult to arrange your ordering. But it gives the, well, this actually doesn't give the numbers to talk about where zone of control and threat zones are yet. You know, to me, it's sort of a wash whether or not you need to discuss these concepts ahead of time, because if you give me a big list of terms, I'm not going to remember them as I get to them. If you give me rules on those terms, the way SPI tended to do up front, because they didn't have a lot of them like more modern games tend to, I usually remember them, but maybe that's because those terms are common, you know, throughout a lot of games. So, remnants are always disorganized or shocked. They cannot attack, but they have 1 strength point for defense, either alone or stacked. We haven't talked about stacking yet. That may be another one of those concepts, eh? Like, I feel like we've gone through movement, so why haven't we hit stacking? We're at the end of the combat units section. Stacking's up here, okay. We have not yet gotten to it. At the beginning of the game, it's not a big deal. There's no stacking allowed. Remnants are never destroyed by bombardment or combat. If they take losses, they're converted into additional levels of disruption. Combat loss results that must be applied to remnants are converted to additional retreat for all the remnants in the hex. This is not the normal limit for conversion of retreats, which is 1. Remnants can only be destroyed if you fail to comply with retreat requirements, or if you eliminate due to overstacking, which I think is just accidental. Remnants are not subordinated to a headquarters, so they can never be in command, which doesn't matter. Remnants, because they can't attack. Remnants cannot move during their friendly maneuvers segment. They can be forced to retreat and fall back as a result of combat or isolation. They can only move voluntarily during the voluntary fallback phase in the opponent's turn. If units are defending against an attack, or if the only units defending against an attack are remnants. So, yeah, let me get to something in a little bit. In 1 or multiple stacks, the attacker loss number produced by the CRT is reduced by 1. That's going to be a hard roll to remember. I can just tell. It might be in the detailed combat procedure. It might not. But I got to tell you, that's the kind of thing that is tough to recall. Remnants alone can't support a prepare or low improvised attack marker. If a unit is reduced to a remnant, it loses the marker. Okay. Let me hit There was something I wanted to talk about. Ah, yes. So the voluntary fallback, I just wanted to touch on this because here's something I see about it. Yeah, I lost the thought. Never mind. Yeah. I may have already said it at some point. During German Remnant Incorporation, they lose a couple of remnants. This is really repetition of the stuff in there. Regiment reforming. During the night turn, you can combine two disorganized remnants that are stacked together. They can't be shocked. They can reform in an enemy zone, but the regiment must have been previously removed from play, and it must be a 2 SP regiment, which means all the regiments are 3, so you get a -1. You don't gain a strength point by reforming. They cannot be reformed up to full strength, and they must be placed on the map in the same hex as the 2 removed regiments in command, and disorganized if they're adjacent to an enemy unit, or reforming if not. In addition to headquarters range limitations, when planning to reform a regiment, bear in mind the headquarters under a retreat marker may not exercise command at all. You have something about command? Yeah. Right. Okay. All infantry units, except the French 58th Division, start the game and enter the game in good order. That's the unit back here. And it's close. But they can suffer disruptions due to combat, bombardment, retreat, fallback. Okay, here are the different disruption status. Reformed, which has or reforming, which has a reforming marker. Disorganized, which has is the backside of the unit. Shocked, which is putting these additional markers on them, and they have numbers as to how many levels of shocking, and there's no maximum to how shocked you can be. The disruption level of the lead defender is reformed or disorganized. It's a +1 DRM for the attacker. When attacking, the attack strength of reforming or disorganized units is halved if they're in command and subordinated to the coordinating headquarters. They cannot attack at all if they're out of command. Their movement for reforming and disorganized is halved during maneuver. In combat, if the disruption level of the lead defender is shocked, that's going to be +2 DRM, and an additional 1 for each additional level of shock. Shocked units can't attack, cannot move during maneuver, but they can retreat or fall back. During mutual disruption recovery of the reorganization phase in the night, non-remnant disrupted units reduce their disruption level, and we went over that. It's between 1 and 3, based on circumstances. Because the Germans are good, they can go up to 3 if they're lucky. Reforming units that reduce their disruption by 1 level become good order, and disorganized units become reforming. And that 1 level, you break up each level into individual steps to manage that. Headquarters. Core headquarters are non-combat units. They have no strength points. Headquarters are used to coordinate attacks, reorganize troops, and direct artillery. They have 1 built-in core medium artillery point. The front side of the counter is the artillery available side. When that artillery is used, or if the counter retreats or moves or whatever, they flip to unavailable. The headquarters location will be a reference to calculate medium artillery range. They can occupy a hex alone or stack freely with any subordinate unit or any remnants, and they don't count towards stacking limits. They cannot stack with units from another headquarters. They're not disrupted. They can move 1 hex during daytime and night maneuver, and that does not affect their artillery. They have no strength points and exert no zones. They cannot be attacked if not stacked with a combat unit. If an enemy unit is adjacent to a lone headquarters, the headquarters has to do an emergency fallback of at least 3 hexes, which will get rid of their artillery. When stacked with combat units, they share with them any mandatory retreat results. They retreat as infantry units would receive a retreat marker, but they ignore disruption. but they are flipped to their unavailable side for artillery. Unit headquarters subordination under command. Each non-remnant infantry unit is subordinated to a headquarters, as indicated by the corps color in the lower third of the counter. These can be a little hard to distinguish. I mean, this is easy, but when I get between this and this, I find it a little difficult. I don't know if they've been tested against any people with color distinguishment problems that are worse than mine. I know things like green can show up as kind of gray, and there might be an issue with that. I don't know what kind of answer there is with that. You could mark the counters, you know, in addition, if you have that kind of issue. It wouldn't be too difficult. Command path and range. Okay. Combat units, this is where the game gets weird. So far, it hasn't seemed too weird, except for this. Units are never destroyed, and when they're isolated, they run away, and stuff like that. But here we get some really weird stuff. Combat units that can trace a valid command path no more than 4 hexes long to their parent headquarters are in command. All right, I'm going to have to be careful here. These might end up forcing me to do some redeployments of those. Unless that headquarters has a retreat marker. Headquarters with a retreat can't be in command of anything. The command path is only traced through the shortest route in hexes as the crow flies. The command path may never bypass an obstructing hex if doing so increases the distance that would be between the unit and the headquarters. Command paths ignore enemy zone of control and threat zones. Interesting. Okay, here's what you can't go through. You can't go through an enemy unit. Great. You can't go through a friendly unit subordinated to another command, and you also can't trace around it, remember? And you can't go through a path from a friendly unit subordinated to another headquarters, whatever its length, which is the 2 units could actually prevent, if they're on the wrong side of the dividing line, could actually prevent either of each other from being in command. That's a little weird. What are the effects? Well, units in command attack at full strength if subordinated to the headquarter coordinating the attack, or at half strength if subordinated to another headquarter. Got to be careful I have all my allied units in command. I think I do. But, let's see, this thing is there. Yeah, I'm safe there. This one is. There's a lot of Entente command headquarters. There's only 2 German ones, which is where the heart of the problem really comes. So I probably want this a little closer. 1, 2, 3, 4, say here. Although that's somewhat at risk. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4 gets me to here. These guys will be out of command. There's not a lot I can do. I have too big a front. I'd rather give up some ground here, I guess. I don't know, because this is worth a lot of points. But I can always open up a pathway for the Entente to be able to break through on one of the flanks. And that's actually probably pretty safe. Okay. Where are we? In command German units that are not adjacent to an enemy unit. Oh, here we go. Okay, and you attack at half strength if subordinated to a different headquarters. In command German units that are not adjacent to an enemy unit may recover up to 3 disruption levels on the die roll. Out of command units attack at half strength if they're subordinated to the coordinating headquarters, but they cannot attack if they're not subordinated to the coordinating headquarters. More of a problem for the Entente. Units always defend at full strength, not a big deal then. Then I'm kind of just dressed here. German regiments must be in command in a hex they're reformed in. Tank groups must be in command when assigned to a division or repositioned. The lead attacker may be chosen among in-command attacking units, must be chosen among in-commanding attacking units, if any. Okay, so there was one weird thing with these traces for command. We're going to see something similar to that when we look at retreat paths. I need to swap batteries. I wish I was a little bit more familiar, because the sequence of play gives you most of the game. But there's a couple of these little pieces that I have to find as I'm working through it. Now, it doesn't hurt me to go over this again and refresh my mind. Of course, it makes the video completely boring, and it's like, why are you doing this, dude? Well, this is just my way of going through the rules, making sure that we have everything that's important to play. It's the same kind of thing I would do with an opponent, but, and, you know, you can make your arguments if that's effective or not. I like to make sure they have all the rules. And whatever insight I can give, which is really very similar to what I'm doing. Zones of control and threat zones. Zones of control are what they sound like. It's the 6 hexes adjacent to the hex that an infantry division, regiment, or remnant has, the 6 adjacent hexes. Headquarters don't have them. Zones of control are never negated. Okay. Phasing units can't move at all during the maneuver advance segments if they're adjacent to an enemy zone of control, but they can still spend movement points. During maneuver, units immediately stop their movement whenever they enter an enemy zone of control. When forced to retreat due to combat or when falling back, a unit may move through enemy zones of control or TZs and suffers no adverse effect for doing so, as long as it doesn't end movement in a ZOC. And remember, you can retreat as far back as you like. So, when a unit attacks into an enemy-occupied hex, assault or low intensity, all enemy units in the attacking zone of control must have been attacked by other phasing units, be planned to be attacked by other phasing units in another combat, or be attacked by the current unit. This is the unlike, I don't. Soaking seems like a pretty common concept in older games. Okay, now the other thing, the extended zones, the threat zones. This is infantry divisions, regiments, and remnants project a threat zone 2 hexes away from the unit, 1 hex beyond the zone of control. These will be negated by either enemy units or by their zones of control. In addition, a unit cannot project a threat zone beyond an adjacent hex in an enemy zone of control. Cannot project a threat zone beyond an adjacent hex in an enemy zone of control. Yeah. That's that the enemy zone not only blocks the threat zone, but it also prevents the threat zone from being generated past the zone of control. They're not affected by terrain. They have no effect on movement, maneuver, retreat, advance, fallback. The only thing they affect is isolation. And there's some nice pictures to help show what is going on here. So what they're saying here is Unit A has zones of control all around it, not able to be negated. Threat zones here, nope, can't get there because I'd be going through the enemy zone of control to get to there. Okay, so you can see where the limits to the picture actually end up. And it's pretty useful. All right, we had talked about stacking and finally get to it. Reinforcements can freely stack in their enemy hex on their turn of arrival. Otherwise, you have limitations. No more than 1 division currently at 7 strength points or more, or up to 3 regiments of the same division, Germans only, obviously, regardless of how big they are, or up to 6 strength points of whatever the hell you got. Remnant can always counts as 1 strength point. Headquarters can freely stack with any subordinated unit or any remnant. Stacking is enforced at the end of movement. In addition, during maneuver, retreat and fallback are not restricted. A division may not move through a hex occupied by another division, regardless of the accumulated strength point strength. However, a division may enter another division's hex if it ends its movement there, and total SPs do not exceed 6 strength points. They say this will be pretty rare. We'll see. If a hex is overstacked at the end of any form of movement, the owning player must eliminate sufficient strength points of their choice to bring the hex within stacking limits. Not sure how you can manage it. Legally. Tracing supply lines. Okay. Here we're again, like with the like with the command and the retreat, this is another place where you have to worry about weird stuff. A supply line connects a unit to its rear and is used to determine whether the unit is isolated or not. Supply lines may never enter an enemy-occupied hex and may never enter an enemy zone of control or TZ unless in a town hex. The supply zone's in the town hex, I think. If a path meeting these requirements cannot be traced, the supply line is blocked and the unit is isolated. Keep in mind that friendly unit presence does not negate enemy zones, but enemy zones of control, but it does for threat zones. Terrain does not affect the supply line determination in any way. I'm not sure I believe that because there's this unless in a town hex. Okay. Entente, and we'll have examples perhaps here. Entente only traces one type of supply line, a path of contiguous hexes back to the friendly map edge. It can be of any length, but it can never move closer to the enemy map edge. So you can't swerve around, right? But you could pull back and, do a diagonal or whatever. If an Entente unit cannot trace a supply line, it's isolated. Yeah, I think that's true with both types. But Germans have two different types of supply lines. A straight east-west line, no variations, and the map grain allows for this. Traced back to the eastern map edge, not crossing the Ain River. Or the shortest path of contiguous hexes to the closest Soissons perimeter hex. Okay, so these units are not in supply, right? I gotta move them. They're not in supply. That's odd. Okay, let me continue this. The shortest contiguous path to the closest Soissons perimeter hexes, but not longer than 4 hexes. No. Can't cross the Ain, but it can follow the Ain. Okay, sweet. So I am able to keep this defense. I thought I was, but if 2 Soissons perimeter hexes are equidistant, you can choose which one to trace to. If you cannot trace to at least one unblocked type of supply line, you count as isolated. The important thing here is there's no divergence. It's pure east-west. An allied unit here, no matter what, these guys are out of supply from that direction. For close to Soissons, you may only trace to the closest hex. And if those closest hexes are blocked, you're isolated. And isolated means you have to fall back. When a unit is 4 hexes from Soissons, the German player can choose to go either straight east or to the Soissons perimeter hex, whichever to the closest Soissons perimeter hex. They don't have to take Soissons because it's closer. Now, what was that about towns? A supply line may never enter an enemy-occupied hex and may never enter an enemy zone of control or TZ unless in a town hex. Yeah, I think I can trace through any town hexes in zones. Okay. If you're not in supply, you're isolated. You may never maneuver, retreat, advance, fall back from a non-isolated position into one that would be isolated unless by doing so you trigger an enemy emergency fallback. Now, this is weird. You can retreat or position yourself in a position that's isolated so long as you isolate the enemy too, and then they have to fall back. That triggers an enemy emergency fallback, which results in the phasing unit, which may result in the phasing unit no longer being isolated. You can only do it if that retreat would cause your isolation to be revoked. A unit may not maneuver or advance if that movement would cause any friendly units to become isolated. Nothing about retreat, though. You can retreat, and then those become like a domino effect. If at any moment during an opponent's maneuver or advance segment a non-phasing unit becomes isolated, it must immediately conduct a fallback of any length as long as it ends in a position where it's no longer isolated. The exception to this is headquarters not stacked with a friendly combat unit must fall back at least 3 hexes. The isolated unit interrupts the ongoing enemy unit in order to perform its withdrawal, and then the enemy can continue movement as such. If the removal of a remnant or a spent entente division causes a friendly unit to become isolated, they generate emergency fallbacks. Here they give an example of that special case where the entente unit A can move into 1612, where it's in zones. There's a zone here because, let's see why the because it could trace a supply line through 1712 and then back to the edge of the map. This is not the example, because the reason I can do that is I have a zone of control into here, and that fails the that destroys the zones of influence. Again, it's going to take some different kind of thinking to play this game correctly. If a friend, just being able to observe, hey, am I isolated or not? If a friendly unit were moved first into 1711, the supply unit of A in Villa Montoire. Okay, so I can't go into Villa Montoire because then I'd be moving my zone of control back here, and then I'd be isolated. If a friendly unit were moved first into 1711, putting the zone of control here, then I could advance further, yeah. Okay. I'm looking for maybe this here, maybe this result. German unit Y intends to move into 1811 from somewhere. In that hex, the unit would be isolated because the zone of control of Entente Unit B severs its supply line that runs straight to the eastern map edge. This would be its only allowable supply line. It's cut. However, moving into 1811 would isolate Unit B by putting a zone of control here. There's already a zone here. So Unit B would have to retreat back west before I'm adjudged. Okay. Oh, there's a lot of rules here, and some of it is the repetition's fault. I'm going to break for a little bit. It's taking me forever, mainly because of the length of the breaks I'm taking. But I do feel like there's enough weirdness here with these kind of issues that I have to kind of work my way through the rules instead of just saying, hey, we know most of the stuff from the sequence of play. You may not feel the necessity, you probably shouldn't feel the necessity to keep watching, but I do need to get this refresher. This is often really helpful to me, even if it is fucking expensive. I think we've seen most of the rules going forward. On maneuver, for example, there's nothing too exciting there, but there's things like these units can't move. If you're in an enemy zone, we knew that. If you have a retreat marker already, if you're shocked, spent, or remnants. But remember, for the Germans at least, they have the opportunity, both sides do, but they have the opportunity to do those fallbacks voluntarily, which are not impacted by this. You can't move so that you cause a friendly unit to become isolated. Division can't move through other divisions in accordance to stacking that we just covered. There's a lot of repetition in it. Again, it's not that bad because it gives you lots of, wherever you look, you find the rules you want. But it isn't so hot in terms of doing it on video, at least. Okay, movement point allowance during the daytime. If you don't have a prepare marker, it's 6. We've already hit this. If you have a prepared, it's 4. Nighttime, we've hit those already. There's a terrain of effects chart, which gives the costs for different things. There's a little bit of weirdness here, but it's covered here with towns. 2 movement points when controlled by the enemy, 1 movement point otherwise. So when you first take control, well, control isn't by last occupied. It's handled by zones of control and influence. So That's what's going to be effective there. The different kinds of assaults, the assault and the low intensity attacks have costs. This is all covered in here. Okay, here's it. Streams that run inside a hex combine with the other non-clear terrain and are ignored for all purposes. Okay. Are there streams that don't run? Here's one. Okay, so there are, this is a bit of garbage. So streams that are not within gullies or whatever they're called, ravines, are the only streams you have to worry about, and they are very, very rare. I'm not sure that there's another one. But of course I will have to look. Okay. So that answers the question of, hey, what about these streams that are in the gullies, you know, well, that are running through the middle of the hex, which are most every damn stream in the game. Yeah, they don't have an effect. There's one up there. Okay. So there's like gullies further away from where it enters the river. Voluntary fallback. Okay, this we do need to look at. This is going to have some of, well, really not much, because it's going to be all affected by the retreat directions. Even if you have a retreat marker, if you're shocked, spent, or a remnant, you can fall back and may have to. Somewhere or another, there's the cost for it. This is the problem with so much detail in here. But I think voluntaries do not cost you a disruption. We'll see. Maybe it'll be in the disruptions. Certain to be in there. Fallback requirements. Movement points, terrain costs are insubstantial. They mean nothing. They can be as far as you like, but headquarters have their restriction that we've talked about, etc. A fallback must conform to the unit's retreat direction, except for the final hex of the fallback, which can be adjacent. Units conducting a fallback may never enter an enemy-occupied hex. They may never move closer to the enemy map edge. They may never end their fallback adjacent to an enemy unit or in a hex where they would be isolated. If you're forced to conduct a mandatory fallback but cannot, you're eliminated, no matter what. Conducting a fallback can enter enemy zones of control zone TZs with no adverse effects, and units stacked together can split up during their fallbacks. Units that fall back, voluntary or not, get a retreat marker if they didn't have one already. Oh no, there is a cost on anything. This includes headquarters, which are also flipped to artillery unavailable. Units with a retreat marker may still conduct an unlimited number of subsequent fallbacks, but they incur an additional disruption each time, and that'll be here. Okay, it is covered in here. The retreat directions. The Entente retreat direction, these are like the supply. Shortest path in hexes from the unit to the friendly map edge that enters the smallest possible number of enemy ZOCs. It sounds like you can swerve. The retreat direction of the German unit, though, is a straight east-west line back to the eastern edge of the map, which cannot cross the Ain but follows its course, or within 4 hexes of Soissons, the shortest path from the unit to a Soissons perimeter hex, provided it enters the smallest possible number of enemy ZOC. These are the same rules as the supply rules, right? I think. Or is this just a repetition of... Yeah. This is the same as the supply line rules, not a repetition. The fact that the rules do repeat themselves so much leads you to question, sometimes something like that. So I'm beginning to blow a little bit more cold on the how much these repeat as I look through it the second time and try to prepare myself to actually play the game instead of just reading the rules straight through. Okay. You have your choice, same as supply rules. Now, the fallback effects. No limit to the number of times you can do it in a turn, but each time that you have a retreat marker on you and you do a fallback, you get a level of disruption. This is except for the artillery, the headquarters, which only take their artillery on available mark, and that's it. If a division with a tank falls back 1 hex, the tank is reduced or eliminated if it's only 1 level. If it falls back more, it's automatically going to be destroyed. Divisional breakdown. Divisions can break down into their particular regiments anytime they execute any type of movement, even if they're not full strength. The strength must be 4 or more in order to break down, because each unit has to be at least 2 strength points. The combativeness rating on the German regiments is reduced by 1, and that's marked on the counters. These guys have a combativeness of 2, but they don't have a divisional level. If we look up at these divisionals, they have combativeness of 2s with the exception of that one. Most of these have a combativeness of 1 with the exception of the 10th. You're kind of scraping the barrel in terms of some of these troops. Artillery. Artillery and air units are not represented physically on the map. You get points that represent artillery assets. There's 4 types of artillery: Corps medium, Army heavy, and air support. They all are the same kind of firepower no matter what the type of artillery. The effect is presented by the same bombardment marker. The types are affected by the restrictions in use. Heavy artillery is less guns for the same effect. Up to 3 Corps and or Army APs and 1 air support AP may be combined to bombard 1 single hex. Place the bombardment marker of the appropriate intensity on the target hex, subtracting the corresponding number of support points. And flip the headquarter providing Corps artillery, if any, to its artillery unavailable. Now, we have these plain markers with 1 point. I don't think there's ever more than 1 air point. I think these are intended to be used as bombardment markers because the actual bombardment markers don't have any 4s. They have 3 as the maximum. As long as you're under 4, you can ignore the planes if you wish and just add to the points there. The Corps artillery points are represented by the headquarters and don't have a track marker. Now, the Corps medium artillery can be fired from the artillery available. We don't have restrictions for range. That's going to be here. Each headquarters has 1 built-in Corps, and you flip it over when you use it. Army artillery you mark on the track, and again, they repeat the availability numbers, which I really don't think need to be there, but okay. Most of this is in the sequence of play. That's kind of so maybe that's the only other place it was. Okay, Corps artillery are always available in AM turn. You get to use them once per 12-hour period. Hence, if they're available AM and they don't get used in the AM, they roll over into the PM. If you didn't get the right roll for them in the AM, they're only available in the PM, and the numbering for that, we already pointed out there's potential issue there. Okay, restrictions. Corps medium artillery can be used 5 hexes from the artillery unit. And this can be coordinated with other... a hex bombarded by the organic artillery of a headquarters may be subsequently attacked by units subordinated to other headquarters, which seems weird. Army medium artillery can only be used to bombard hexes within 5 of any friendly headquarters. And the heavy can go anywhere on the map, and the air support can go anywhere on the map. The air support's different because it's not at night. It does not suffer a DRM penalty when it's used alone. for not having a friendly unit adjacent to the target hex, which might be a reason to, again, distinguish that you're using the airplane. Core substitution. The closest friendly unit to a hex targeted by core artillery must be subordinated to the same core. Hex bombarded by the organic may be subsequently attacked by units subordinated to... The closest friendly unit targeted must be subordinated to the same... If there's more than one unit equally close, at least one of them must be subordinated. Okay, it doesn't have to be the lead, though, I guess. Remnants are not subordinated to anything, which to me means... Yeah, you could still use another unit to direct the artillery fire. Observation. Core and artillery bombardment is resolved with a -1 DRM if there is no friendly combat unit adjacent to the target hex. Air support doesn't suffer from this when used alone. And we're going to be needing to look at the combat tables here. There's the bombardment resolution, number of points, a die roll, modifiers to the die roll, and they give you different results. Okay. During phasing player bombardment, so when you're next to a friendly prepare marker when you bombard, that's +1 DRM, and this is on the chart. But it says only during the assault segment, but not during the friendly assault segment. This is just weird. Makes sense. Makes sense. Because the defensive fire lines are a response to the prepares, I guess. Non-phasing. During opponent's AM or PM operation, bombardment can be conducted by non-phasing. During the opponent's assault segment is one of the option in the form of defensive during the opponent's assault segment with an automatic +1 for being targeted at a hex adjacent to a friendly prepare marker. This weirds me out. During the opponent's AM and PM operations phase, bombardment can be conducted by the non-phasing player in the form of a defensive artillery barrage during the opponent's assault segment, with an automatic +1 DRM for being targeted adjacent to a friendly prepare marker. I don't know if I believe this. This would be an enemy prepared marker to the Germans. And I think, given that their major use for the prepared marker is to set defensive artillery ranges, as far as I can tell. I think this is a typo that's carried over from the phasing players firing without appropriate thought to that. Now, it says to go to 15.5, but that's just the chart. Unless shock spent or reduced to remnants, units targeted by defensive artillery barrage that become disrupted retain their prepare or low in improvised attack. Nighttime bombardment. The night turn is a mutual bombardment phase in which the Entente and then the German place bombardment markers. After they're placed, the bombardments are resolved. They've got an automatic penalty for a night turn, and they get the additional penalties as well for terrain and whatnot. Okay, what are the results that you get off of this? Well, a little d is a disruption level of all units present in the hex by 1 level, but not higher than disorganized. This is all spelled out in the chart as well. A big D is increase the disruption of all units present by 1 level, but not lower than disorganized. What that means is you're not going to bombard somebody into a reforming status, for what that's worth. Well, you can. The parenthesized D is during night activities, it increases to the heavier D. And a 1D does the disruption as per a capital D and also inflicts a loss on 1 non-remnant unit present. If there's only remnants, that will be an additional level of disruption for all the remnants in the hex. Okay. I gotta pause a bit. Before we go on, a little bit of personal shit, just because I like to throw that in, even in the rules reading now. What the hell's wrong with me? Tonight, well, yesterday I started it. Tonight I started dealing with some of the after effects of that, which are problematic as well. But last time I was on unemployment, I was lucky that I was officially working in Minnesota and not in Arizona. Although that caused tax issues that were kind of painful to deal with. Minor, you know. It's like, oh, I have to fill out 2 states' tax forms. But doing the unemployment side of it was really wonderful. Minnesota had a nice unemployment system. Now, I understand the reasons behind it, but both Arizona and, it turns out, Oregon, which is a fairly liberal state that I find it more surprising about, although New York harshed its up too. They really make you jump through a lot of hoops to get your unemployment. Hoops that, to a degree, that like are going to make it, you know, I have a certain amount of bullshit I can deal with in my life, right? I can deal with the bullshit involved in applying for jobs a couple times, you know, doing a couple of things a week or whatever towards job application, which is probably less than they require. I looked at their thing. They want you to do at least 2 applications and 3 other job-related things, which kind of means that I'm going to be doing things that are applications and stuff for jobs I can't possibly get, just to fulfill their requirements. And to a large extent, what it means is I'm going to be less likely to get a job because I'm fulfilling their unemployment requirements. Which, you know, I mean, if it comes to me, which would I rather do? Fill out this bullshit and claim to be doing things, or, you know, actually have to be working full time? And, you know, it's like, sure, they give me a lot less money on unemployment, but, you know, I'm sort of undecided on that. Am I retiring or not? And, you know, I'm willing to take the unemployment, and if it was the right kind of unemployment, without all kind of documentation and jumping through hoops and all this shit, you know, hell, it would probably incentivize me to be continuing in my job search. But instead, I'm going to be probably spending most of my time, most of my tolerance for bullshit, dealing with the unemployment system rather than actually doing things that are more likely to get me jobs. Anyway, I need to relight my pipe and get back to the rules. One of the few things that we really haven't touched on much in the game is the combat. The bombardment as well. But it doesn't look that terribly complicated, right? It's an odds chart, a die roll, there's different tables, different sets of modifiers. That's pretty much what you need to know, right? But it's spelled out here. Combat's voluntary. Done completely one at a time. We talked about that already. You're allowed to do one of 2 things. 1 or more units in 1 or more hexes attacking a single enemy-occupied hex, or 1 or more units stacked in a single hex attacking 2 or more enemy-occupied hex. So, yeah. You can't do multiple attacking units against multiple defending hexes at the same time. You're going to have to rearrange that somehow. There's no conditions under which that's allowed, which is a little different from the sort of classics in 1970 era games, or 70s era. All enemy units in the attacking unit zone of control must be attacked, though, so you do have to soak. Here we repeat this, which I think was stated before, so even the note. A unit can attack once in the assault segment and once in the low intensity, and it can attack them both in the same turn as long as it, you know, purchased its attack orders in the right way. Units stacked in the same hex do not have to attack together. Some can choose to attack a different hex, part of a different combat, or choose not to attack at all. Of course, you probably have 1 unit per hex for the guy who's doing most of the attacking. So, each defending unit can only be attacked once per assault segment and once per low intensity. Each defending unit stacked in the same hex must be attacked together. ZOC, the requirement we've already gone through these. Types of combat. Assaults, which will use the assault resolution table. Low intensity, use this table. The assault resolution is a stronger table, but it's going to tend to cause more casualties to both sides. Which you can see there's a lot of zeros in this. Assaults require a repair marker. The low intensity attacks require you buy a low intensity attack marker. Command and disruption status restrictions are in play. You can't attack unless you're good order, basically. I don't see a penalty against reforming, actually. Or a restriction against reforming. I thought there was. That's not going to be a case. The only reforming unit on the first turn of the game doesn't seem to have that, but I'm not sure. I guess you're allowed to. I don't know. Seems weird. Do we have anything like attacker reforming? I don't see it. The defender reforming gives a penalty, but I guess the attacker is allowed to be reforming and attack pretty much at full strength. Wonder if that's a missed roll. The combat procedure applies. I've got to look that up because there was an attack eligible. Maybe this is the one place where I'm not sure. You might not be able to put a marker on a unit like that, in which case, gosh, I don't know whether or not you'd be able to. That would be under the movement rules, which we did not long ago. Okay, spent units no penalty on reforming units there either. Honestly, okay, here we go. If a reforming or disorganized has less movement points, which appears to be not enough, but that's if you're under a prepare marker. And now, where did the costs end up? Like, they're repeated so many times, I thought they were in the right place somewhere else, but I'm having a hard time finding it now. Oh, here it is. No, that's movement points for movement point for hex movement. Oh, boy. So my ability to remember where things are is being disrupted by the repetitions. I'm beginning to come down against this. I think it's too repetitive. Right, we got regiment reforming here. Does that tell me anything? No, that's something else. That's not reforming units. Is that what they're actually called? Yeah. So it's in the sequence of play that it tells me the cost for putting things. It's not in that part of the sequence of play. Maneuver. Combat units not conducting an assault can use 6 movement points. If reforming or disorganized, it's reduced in half, which is not enough to get a prepared marker, but it is enough to be able to do a low intensity, and I don't see any restrictions. So I think reforming units can attack. Let's keep looking. Is there another penalty against this? And I mean, I really do have to look it up this way. Doesn't look like it unless shock spent or reduced to remnants. Okay. Units that become disrupted retain their marker and their ability to attack. And yeah, disrupted is the step even worse than reforming. So yeah, okay. All right. Yeah. Where are we? Combat procedures for assaults and low intensity attacks between them. First, Defensive bombardments will be taking place. Then the attacker, and this is in the sequence of play, we did discuss this already, then the attacker launches their bombardments and takes care of them, records any effects. If you do that, if you roll the die on the bombardment table during an assault or an improvised attack step, you must continue on with it. So if you do prep fire, you must fight. You pick a lead attacker. This has to be one of the in-command attacking units, and that'll determine which headquarters is coordinating the attack. The attacker will use his combativeness, DRM, and disruption status for the lead unit only. I don't see a disruption status modifier for the attacker, but here it is. If the attacker is reduced, they'll be at half strength, and they have to be, this chart is actually kind of complicated because you might not be able to attack. So, for example, if you've got a disorganized or reforming unit, it has to be subordinated to the coordinating headquarters and in command, which means you're not going to throw in a disorganized or reforming unit from another command just to add some strength. So, the lead defender, the defender has to pick a lead unit. Remnant cannot be selected if there's non-remnants. The lead defender will apply its combativeness, DRM, and its disruption status. Attacker combativeness, defender combativeness. Yeah, they're both covered in there. To the die roll and the terrain it occupies will determine terrain DRM. If the attacker attacks into 2 or more hexes, only the terrain occupied by the lead defender, which is chosen by the defending player, is taken into consideration. If the lead defender occupies a ravine, tanks may not apply their DRM to the attack. The lead defender must suffer the first loss called by the CRT, same thing with the lead attacker. The combat strength is equal to its initial strength minus any losses taken. Remnants have a defensive strength of 1. Sorry. Attacking units have their strength reduced or not allowed to attack based on this. This then spells all that chart out. Defending units always use their full strength when defending. Disruption is a penalizing DRM to the defender, which is their reformed and disorganized. Shock, additional shock levels all add to the attacker's capabilities. You figure out the combat odds. This is as normal, rounding down, right? Rounded in favor of the defender. You put the DRMs on, you roll a 6-sided die, and you get a result. What are the results? Okay. Apply CRT mandated disruption on both sides, including aggravated disruption. CRT mandated losses to both sides. All right, we're not at disruption yet. We'll get to that in a moment. On an X result, the attacker chooses what X is, 1 or 2. And that will be the base losses. The attacker's losses will be reduced by 1 if all the defending units are remnants. The attacker and defender losses are increased by 1 if the attacker's strength is 12 or more and the defender's strength is 6 or more. Is this spelled out anywhere? This is not spelled out on the combat section, and that's somewhat problematic because oh no, there it is. There it is. Cool. Okay. Yeah, this would be problematic if that was not on the chart, but I found it. That's what happens when you don't stare at the charts and zone out on them, but I'm too old for that nowadays. Defender's losses are reduced by 1 if he chooses to convert a loss into an extra hex of retreat. The attacker chooses distribution of losses on the attacking unit, defender on the defending unit, but there's priorities to where the losses have to go, which has to do with the lead and other things, which we're not at yet. You execute the retreat, if any, and increase disruption by 1 level for all retreating combat units that already had a retreat marker. Apply all disruption and loss results, execute all retreats from one combat before resolving the next. And if isolations occur due to this, that could cause an immediate retreat, I believe. Let's see what we got here. Right. No, that happens down here. That happens after all assaults. So yeah. So declared assaults will get to continue through. Okay, a little d, just like on the bombardment table, indicates the side increases their disruption by 1 level, but not higher than disorganized. A big D, not lower than disorganized. Aggravated disruption. If you roll a natural 1 on the CRT, and that's spelled out in the charts as well, regardless of any modifiers and final result, the lead attacker gets an aggravated disruption. If there's no disruption, they get a little d. If they get a little d, it turns to a big D. If they get a big D, well, they get a bonus. Nothing bad happens. The number left, right, attacker, defender. Then these reductions are repeated yet again. Yeah, this is excessive. I'm generally in favor, but yeah. The number right of the slash on the CRT is losses. Again, the increases, destructions, reductions. Loss application priorities. The first loss of any combat result is applied to the lead unit. The remaining losses in priority to non-remnants. A non-remnant unit cannot be selected to sustain 2 losses before all other non-remnants have taken 1. Apart from that, losses are distributed as you like. So if every unit takes 1, then you can concentrate the losses on 1 unit or something. A German unit reduced to 1 strength point is replaced by a generic remnant. A shocked unit that is reduced is replaced by a shocked remnant. I think you can't choose remnants. I think we passed that already. Yeah, if only remnants were defending or all defending units have been reduced to remnants, losses are applied to remnants. Remnants cannot be destroyed by combat, but yeah, otherwise losses can't be applied to the remnants. The superscript on the right is the mandatory retreat on the first turn of the game. And is that, yeah, just the assault segment. It doesn't have an effect at any other time in the game. No retreats are allowed after bombardment. That means directly after bombardment. If it's a bombardment combined with an assault, that doesn't protect you from retreating. Repeats of stuff that we've read again and again and again. Repeats of the retreat rolls, retreat direction. You know, I mean, this is beginning to get absolutely ridiculous. Yep, still that. Voluntary loss reduction. This is the 1 hex retreat conversion. Repeated again and again. Yeah. Disruption resulting from retreat. If you get multiple retreat, if you get a retreat on top of a retreat marker, you get a disruption from that. During low improvised attacks, you're able to advance after combat. Well, during that combat phase, you're allowed to do an advance, and it's a 1 hex advance. Prepared attacks can also do it. They don't lose their marker. The low interest attack loses its marker, however. Reinforcements, they'll be placed on the map at the beginning of the AM operations phase. I think we already had the rules for this. We had the rules for core subordination already. Column movement. We have not. This is a rule that has not been read before. Reinforcements operate normally once placed on the map, but they can use column movement on their turn of arrival only. Reinforcements may use column movement only if they start their movement on a road hex. Reinforcement units using column movement expend 1/2 per hex entered, regardless of other terrain present in the hex, as long as they move along the road and do not move within 2 hexes of the enemy. Reinforcement units are free to leave the road at any time or move within 2 hexes of an enemy unit, but they apply normal movement point cost to do so. After they do so, or as they do so. Once they leave the road, they may no longer benefit from the road movement rate, even if they subsequently move back. Which is to say, you can road move part of your movement and then stop road moving when you're too close or whatever. All right, that's the rules. And yeah, This is, normally I don't mind repetition, but it really does feel like this was in extreme excess. This is not that complicated a game. It's an innovative design. There are new things here. I can understand the need to bash them in a little bit heavier, but I think you could take out like a third of the duplication and get this down to about half the size somehow. I don't know. It just almost every roll. This may be the only exception, is repeated at least once, probably 2 or 3 times. And it really feels like there are whole sections that are all repeated elsewhere, and that, as I said, there are advantages to the repetition, but this is taking it to an extreme that even I can't support. Although reading through it, especially since I read the rules not in one sitting, especially if there's 32 pages of them, I read the rules over several sittings, and sometimes it's while I'm on the crapper or whatever. So in some ways, it's like, well, I don't know. It's helping refresh, but yeah, this is more than is necessary, I think. Anyway, the system does look interesting, and we're going to jump in and fiddle around and, start playing it, see where we go with it. As long as the heat wave goes, we're down here anyway, so I got to do something about that. Every time I'm down here, I have to say that. A particularly pretty moment in time for the sunrises, etc. So I thought I'd just grab this one.